everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. In today's episode, Pat and I want to take some time to talk about how Airsoft has impacted us outside of the game of Airsoft. I mean, we all play Airsoft because we enjoy it, it's fun, there's different aspects that, we like more or less or what have you, but we've all gravitated towards this sport, and it's easy to just lump it into this category of one of your other 100 hobbies that you have that you just do for fun. And of course we do it for fun, but there are really meaningful ways that Airsoft impacts airsofters. And it's not really until the whole Bill C-21 thing started happening in Canada that we started looking at ways that Airsoft had impacted our communities, both in terms of commercial, financial benefits that it brings, etc., but also the joy and pleasure that it brings to people's lives and the place that it can occupy. And in a variety of different ways, it will impact people differently. So we thought that we talk about how Airsoft has really impacted us, the things that we have learned about and grown as a result of playing the sport, and basically everything in between. And to start it off, I think everyone talks about a lot of the friendships that you make playing Airsoft. And I think it's really, really a good place for us to get talking about this.
For sure. That's very much one of the biggest things about Airsoft for me is the friends I've made along the way, as it were. Our team, right? Not exclusively, but definitely with a certain emphasis. And it's worth noting, at least for me, that these are guys who, they're awesome. They're my friends. I enjoy hanging out with them a lot. Not necessarily even while we're playing Airsoft, right? But they're not necessarily folks I would have met through any other channel. I don't share much of a social group with Chris outside of our crew. His friends are awesome, but I don't know them other than through him.
Yeah.
Kyla and Johnny went to schools that I subbed at very early in my career as substitute teacher, but we sort of met them through really John's dad.
Yeah, well, there's the age group thing, right? That's right out the gate. We've said it before, but if you play Airsoft, you're going to the field, and if you're 30-something, there are players there who are 16-something. There are players there who are 20-something. And then you have players in their 40s and 50s and dinosaurs like Chaz in their, late 50s or whatever. We love you, Chaz. But these are people who, in a run-of-the-mill, typically will not interact with each other on a daily basis. It's just not the same social circle.
Yeah, I don't hang out with a lot of people who are 20. I work with 16-year-olds, and sometimes I see them at Airsoft, and that's like, hello.
Yeah.
And that's usually honestly pretty fun, because who doesn't want to shoot at their history teacher with a BB gun?
Yeah, really, no question.
It's an easy sell. But so meeting people who I wouldn't otherwise have gotten to know is a big part of this sport for us.
Yeah.
For us, well, a big part of this sport for me.
For sure. I think for all of us. I think about the guys, like you were saying, on the team. What's interesting about hanging out and becoming friends with people who you don't really share a social circle with, and in many ways are not the typical people who you would normally have as your friend group, is really that it opens up your perspectives, because you get exposed to perspectives that normally you would never have gotten exposed to. If I think about Chris in particular, he shares certain attitudes and characteristics that it's not that they're absent in like my family and other friend group, but they're not as common. So I look at my friends, and primarily they're people who are, university educated people, book smarts, very interested in talking about theories and theoretical stuff. And Chris, while he's not any of those things, but he also had this added angle of, well, I'm an electrical engineer and I make stuff and I program stuff for a living, and I live in this very real world of how do things need to operate and work to be effective, as opposed to how do they work in theory. I need to understand how they work in practice. I'm really focused on what's in front of me as opposed to thinking about what could be or different possible scenarios. And it's not to say that he doesn't do any of that stuff, but that's his perspective, his primary perspective. And I benefit a lot from that in talking to him and having conversations, because that's not immediately where my mind goes. And I would never have met him if airsoft was not a thing that we shared.
Absolutely.
And that's the same thing I think about John's dad, who's, old enough really to be my dad, if he had me pretty young, let's be honest, but still, he's an airline pilot. And so the conversations that you have with him, and although we do share some shared interests outside of airsoft, the conversations that we have are very different than I'm going to have with John, because John's interests are different, his age group is different, his mannerisms are different. All of that is as a function of being exposed to players who we created a team with. And that's to say nothing of the players who we meet at the field who we're not necessarily good friends with, but who still are part of this, for lack of a better term, airsoft, diaspora of players, right? Who are, by the very nature of St. John's as a university town, we have people who come here to learn from away, and then, they're here for a few years and they leave again. And then we get to befriend people from different countries. There was a guy who we played with, for better or for worse, from Ukraine, and he was a laugh. And he brought his own personality and his own, take on his own worldview, let's say. Now we have a lot of guys who play airsoft with us from the Philippines, and that's super interesting. There's a guy at the local field who is Japanese, and he brings that, into, and it's not that all our conversations are about what it's like in the country that you're from, or whether your parents are from, your ancestors are from, but it just is interesting. You get to learn about people, and normally you don't necessarily get exposed to those same kinds of people in other hobbies, where other people who are doing them with you might be very much like yourself.
I mean, one of the things that I've learned from from airsoft and a couple of other sort of related hobbies that I'll get to in a minute is that there really is a benefit to sweating alongside someone in terms of just a development of comfort with that person pretty quickly. Like, you don't necessarily develop a deep rapport instantaneously or anything, but you develop the comfort to have a chat, right?
Yeah.
And so you get to talk to a ton of people at an airsoft game from everywhere, right? And those people bring different attitudes and different interests and different knowledge bases to you. Just a space where you are having a chat about airsoft, about life, about, where to go to get a burger after.
Yeah. And I think as a result of our community being smaller than a lot of really big communities on the mainland and stuff like that, we do get closer with the community in general, right? People know you by name. They know, me and Pat and people who've been in the community a really long time, because of who we are. Same thing with, Chief and his guys. People know their names because they've been here a really long time. But that doesn't mean that on the flip side, we don't know the names of players who we've only played with half a dozen times, whether that's Rourke or Keita or people like that. I mean, we've played alongside them. We've sweat alongside them. We've had really good times. And as a consequence, you get to know people's names and you get to know them a little bit better. And that is something that's really not to be understated with airsoft, because you share this really niche sport. You're going to get a chance and an opportunity to meet a lot of players, and you should take advantage of that whenever possible, understanding that some people don't like meeting other people, and that's okay. What I'm trying to say, though, is that airsoft presents you that opportunity that you otherwise would not have had if you weren't doing it.
Yeah, for sure. And it gives you an easy way of making a connection, which is super helpful, especially after sort of this strange year where I think we've all probably contracted our social circle by necessity, if nothing else.
Absolutely.
And there is an adjustment to going back to seeing people and talking to them and just interacting with the rest of the human race.
You also mentioned before, the benefit of sweating alongside people. And that's another thing that you get from airsoft that is not to be understated. There is an opportunity when you play airsoft to use it as a means of physical exercise, right? It can be a way that you get up off the couch, get out of your house a little bit, get out of bed, whatever you're going to do, and go be physically active in an environment. And airsoft is really good exercise in a variety of different ways. Number one, there's no question that the running around and sprinting can certainly be a good form of cardio. Now, you're not going out and running 5K during an airsoft game. I mean, you you may, if it's a super huge milsim or something like that, but chances are you're not like doing long distance running, but you're doing a lot of anaerobic activity, right? Lots of explosive movements, lots of sprinting. And if you're playing on like smaller fields like speedball fields, or even on fields like we play at Frontline, there's a lot of darting around.
Yeah,
And as a
absolutely.
consequence of that, if you're anything like me, you're going to sweat a lot.
And you're gonna, end up, in many cases, hiking a bit to get to the field, which can be great. It's a different kind of cardio, but it's still cardio. You end up, especially if you're me, carting around big, heavy piles of stuff for people.
Yep.
So it's I wouldn't say it's like in any way equivalent to going to the gym, but you do get a little bit of lifting of stuff and moving it around, and it can be a really good motivator just to get, like you said, out of your house, out of bed.
Yep.
Because there are lots of people who play airsoft who are not super super fit. At the moment, I'm one of them, and it's providing me a motivation to go exercise more because I want to be a more effective player.
Yeah, if you're on the field and you're like, wow, like I'm out of breath, I'm winded after running 100 meters or whatever, maybe that's your motivator to go and get a few runs in while you're, during your work week or whatever, or to hit the gym, right? Get on a treadmill or start lifting so you make your legs more powerful, stronger, whatever, do sprints, all this kind of stuff. Like you just said, that it can absolutely be a motivator if you find that your performance is not where it's been in the past, or where you want it to be when you compare yourself to what the necessities of your field are.
Yeah, it can
right?
be a great encouragement to stop skipping leg day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, I'm not harshing on anyone, but that can be your motivation if that's something that you want to achieve. Right.
100%. And one of the things that can be hard for people who are, working on developing better fitness is seeing results, in an attainable goals kind of way. And airsoft is a place you'll see them.
Absolutely.
You'll get faster and you'll get shot less.
Well, and in my work, we often say that what gets measured gets improved. So if you have a measure that you can look at, then that will certainly help you. Like if, for example, you know that it's a 1 kilometer hike into your field, for example, and you're winded when you get there, and after a couple of months of exercising, you realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm not winded anymore when I get to the field. That's your measure of success. Additionally, a lot of people wear like wearable fitness trackers, whether it's like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or a Garmin watch or whatever. Those can provide you a lot of really good data points if you're a bit of a nerd like me, to really show your improvement in a very meaningful way, especially if you pick up running, for example. That's a place where you will see very significant improvements very quickly if you stick at it. So just if airsoft is going to be your motivation for that, that's something you can consider. And I know for myself, like that's why I got into running, right? And now it's a huge part of my daily routine. It's a huge part of maintaining my mental health, maintaining my physical health, especially as I get older, making sure that, my cardio is good and I'm taking care of my body in the way that I need to make sure that I prevent injuries in the longer term.
It's been a motivator for me in that regard in the past and is again right now. So that's a huge positive.
Absolutely.
And it relatedly, in terms of sort of, what little I do to maintain my physical health, it's also been an introduction for me to the fact that I really do enjoy sort of physical combat sports a lot. And so if I hadn't done airsoft, I think I would have been a lot more reluctant to get into sort of historical European martial arts. The realization that like I like sort of competing with other people in sort of like physical combat activities, coupled with the realization that I really don't mind, getting a couple of bruises doing it, has done a lot to make me more open to just being like, yeah, I'll try that. Why not? Right?
Yeah, and I think it ties it neatly to other hobbies that you pick up as a result of airsoft. And I think about you in particular with gun teching and stuff, working on little fiddly machines. Otherwise, in our history, like we did a lot of, like wargaming with miniatures and stuff, but little fiddly machines is not something that I would have really associated with our particular interests. And then learning to do related stuff. So like soldering and electrical and all this kind of stuff is not something that, if you had asked me, 15 years ago, hey, do you think Pat would ever be interested in that? I don't think the answer, I would have said yes, right? Knowing you how I did.
I've gotten a little better at physics than your average high school history teacher is because of it, in terms of just reading about how these things work and why. But yeah, no, I definitely wouldn't have ever expected to be the kind of person who was like, yeah, you know, sit down and solder a bunch of stuff together and play around with this today. It's not a thing that I would have assumed I'd be good at, beyond the fact that like I have the sort of fine motor skills from painting toy soldiers and the patience to do it,
Yeah.
um, which is sort of another hobby overlapping into this one. But hey, whatever works, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's been a thing that I've really mostly enjoyed doing. You know, we've talked about before that I've had days where I'm like, oh my god, why?
As have we all, yeah.
But aside from those moments, like yeah, it's a fun hobby. I enjoy teching for the most part. Enough so that I'm usually willing to do it for people when they go, hey, my gun's broken again.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's not a skill set I would have picked up. And talking to Chaz and the other guys in the Discord, and more, I guess I should say more reading because I'm a terrible lurker. But I mean, I always reply when you summon me, so at least that's functional. But
That's true.
yeah, it's been really cool. It's again not a skill set that I would really have otherwise, and it's been useful, right? I've learned more about how machinery works through doing this than almost anything else I've done, and a surprising amount of it is extrapolatable to messing around with bits and pieces of cars, airbrushes, because they're literally just another air compressor, other stuff like that.
Yeah, doing your own soldering if you wanted to, do stuff in the maker space, you want to 3D print stuff and circuit boards and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
It's relatable skills,
and
absolutely.
I've done some soldering for people who are just like, hey, you know, I need this connected to this. I'm like, I can do that. Won't look super pretty, but I can do it.
Right, or like even stuff like changing a battery from a Tamiya connector to a Dean's connector, and like yes, that is directly airsoft related, but you can do that for any battery, not necessarily just airsoft batteries. And it's an important skill to understand how to do it properly and make sure that you don't wreck the battery when you're doing it and all this kind of stuff.
Yes, don't wreck the battery. Don't zap myself. Other dumb shit Pat's done.
Yeah, anytime you're dealing with current, you got to be careful. But so the thing about it is that we often, and we've talked about this I think before, we don't necessarily look at the skills that we're picking up outside of the airsoft field as being sort of marketable skills that are like important that you can take to your day job or that you can make money off of, right? But if you think about some of the things that we've done as well in terms of like photography and videography, I mean, I've been a portrait photographer for long before I started playing airsoft. I've shooting film before I started shooting digital, and started shooting digital in 2004. I didn't start playing airsoft till 2006. So I had a lot of time sort of under the belt. And when I started playing airsoft, I took pictures here and then, but I just basically wanted to play. And it's not until much later that 2009, 2010-ish, that I was like, okay, well, hang on, I can make video as well, and started making very basic videos and all this kind of stuff. And then we started making videos for this channel, right? Which one of our first ones was like the tips for beginners video that got a lot of traction, which is how many people still find the channel today. And those are all important skills too, like learning how to write content that is educational. Like, yeah, we're talking about Toy Soldier. Yeah, we're talking about like going out to the weekend and shooting your friends with BB guns. But the skills that are required to properly structure a piece of educational material that you are going to then present to people and have the skills to present it, and then also the skills to shoot it and edit it. Those are all skills that are translatable to just about any other educational video project that you can be working on.
Funnily enough, in terms of, how has Airsoft affected my life stuff, one of the things that has to get mentioned for me is doing this podcast was really good prep for having to then sit down and talk as a head on a screen for 30 students at a time for a couple of months this year. Right? Teaching online is definitely a different gig. And just the fact that I'd gotten comfortable doing this with you and interacting in this way, and like, I mean, yes, we both play video games, so we've talked online a lot, but this is a lot closer to teaching than
Yeah.
playing, Street Fighter is.
For sure, because you have to engage people, right? When you're talking at them, it's not just enough to deliver the material. If you're playing a video game, for example, if you're playing like an RPG like World of Warcraft, or you're playing a fighting game or whatever, you have this other piece of content which you are engaged with, and the conversation is sort of ancillary. Whereas when you're teaching, you have a message that you have to communicate, but that's only going to work if the other person is listening to you.
Yeah, and there are certainly, as every student and every teacher found out this year, there are a lot of barriers to that when you're a talking head on a computer screen, because like there's a mute button, and I had kids who admitted to me after the fact that, like, sir, I wasn't really feeling today's lesson, so like I muted you and watched a movie or played League of Legends or whatever. And that's a thing you have to deal with, right? Yeah. And I guess predominantly because I'm a nerd, I was like, yeah, no, I can understand that, and would just go over the lesson with them. But like, there were people who got that and were like, oh, very irritated, right? You know, much grumbling occurred.
But I mean, you're human. You don't pay attention 100% of the time either.
No one does.
I've had full-on conversations with you where I know you're zoned out and you just go, yep, mm-hmm. Or, oh, wow, that's crazy. And then, I'm 99% sure nothing went in your brain. And that's okay. We literally all do that. And if you tell me that you don't, I will not believe you.
I mean...
Not you specifically, you the listener. If you tell me, no, Phil, that never happens to me, I do not believe you.
I can't tell him that because he's known me forever.
Yeah.
He's like, Pat, I know exactly what your herder face looks like.
But it's true. If you think about the average person who's listening to this podcast right now, if they listen to podcasts the way that most people listen to podcasts, they're likely doing something else. Right? So people will say, oh, I'm on my drive into work, and so I got the podcast on in the car. Oh, I'm working on a bunch of guns, and we know it's Wednesday morning, so I'm going to put Pat and Phil on, and we're going to listen to what they have to say. There's no way you are 100% attentive in those situations, and that is fine. That's totally okay.
And I mean, most people only have an attention span, like, unless you're very good at paying attention as a skill you've worked to develop, of 20 minutes before they're sort of like, mind's going to wander for 4 or 5, and then they can come back for another 20 minutes.
Yeah, for sure. And so when you're designing content, right, especially if it's going to be like longer content, like these podcasts are basically just, call your hits with Pat and Phil, listen to them ramble for half an hour. But if you look at our videos on the channel where we do more content, it's important for them to either be relatively short, like, 10 minutes-ish, right? Or if they're going to be longer, they have to be engaging. There has to be stuff in there that will keep you hooked. And there's a whole reason why when you look at the YouTube metrics, they give you stuff like your retention rate. How long do people watch your video before they unclick or go somewhere else? Because that helps you design content that's going to be more appealing to the people who are actually paying attention, right? Who are listening. So anyways, all this to say that this is a skill. It's a skill that I've learned. It's a skill that, Pat, you're just saying that you've learned to deal with this online education piece. And that's valuable. And so if you're out there, we know there's people on our channel who are making other content. We've seen them share it with us and stuff. Like, kudos to you. That's a skill that you're learning. And if you wanted to, at some point, you could translate that to other means and potentially use that to supplement your income, or maybe as your primary source of income. Who knows?
And thank you for sharing content with us that we can watch.
Yes.
Right, to go right back to what Phil was just saying, I toss on airsoft podcasts while I'm teching. I'm definitely one of those people who doesn't actually enjoy a quiet room very much most of the time, right? I'll listen to someone talk about airsoft in between listening to power metal while I work on guns or paint toy soldiers or do lesson planning and mark, honestly.
For sure.
It helps prevent one from going completely crazy.
And I think, too, not to go too far down this segue, but if you're thinking about the kinds of things that you're learning from airsoft, if you think about social media in general, like, there is a big learning curve here, but there's no denying that social media is absolutely a way that you can earn a living. And there's a learning curve to it, right? I'm not at the bleeding edge of social media, let's say. Like, I use Instagram and I use YouTube, and that's pretty much it. Like, I'm not hip with the youths making TikToks. That's not really my jam, nor do I really know anything about it, to be completely honest. But there's absolutely a space here for you to learn and grow in using all of these different tools that exist in order to build a social media presence, build a brand. And if you learn how to do those things for your airsoft team or your airsoft content, whatever that is, that is also absolutely a translatable skill that you can use as part of a job. You could be a social media manager for the business that you work for. You could be part of a social media management firm. Like those are all things that you can point to and say, "Hey, look at this! All this content that I've made. This is what it looks like. This is what I'm capable of." And that serves as almost a de facto resume for you in the quality of your work. Those are things that you can get from doing airsoft that are not directly tied to what you're doing on the field.
I mean, ultimately, that becomes part of, if you're trying to create that sort of career for yourself, or even trying to move into that sort of career or whatever, that's your portfolio, right? No one hires someone for marketing without seeing what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe they're looking at it and going like, oh, it's content for airsoft, but Bill can go, hey, I put this all together myself. I did it often on a shoestring budget, relatively speaking.
Yep.
And yeah, it can work out really well for you. Plus, you can have a lot of fun doing it, right? So it's this sort of thing where you're creating content. You can, if you get monetized and stuff on YouTube, you can make a little bit of money. If you do really, really well, you can make a whole lot of money, obviously. We don't.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, for us, this is about having fun. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces of this is, airsoft is really fun, right? We make a podcast about it because we find it so enjoyable. And obviously, it's, as we talked about, it influences a bunch of other aspects of our lives. It influences the way we view the world and think about things.
Absolutely.
I know infinitely more about guns than I would have if I hadn't gotten into airsoft. I know more about real steel firearms and real steel shooting and the legality of those in Canada than I ever would have had I not gotten into airsoft, right? My education is very liberal. My family background is very liberal and very urban.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have a place really other than going, like shooting 22 with my uncles. Or I guess maybe going hunting with them the like 3 times a year they go, where I would have had any exposure to that. And literally yesterday I had a conversation with someone about Bill C-21 and about the fact that the structure of the bill looks like it was written, or at least like a lot of the research was done by people who don't know very much about firearms. And the fact that I think, even though I generally am quite left-leaning in my politics, that writing a law without knowing anything about your subject is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
And I apologize for the sort of like brief political aside there, but that's knowledge that I just wouldn't have if I hadn't gotten into airsoft.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think about all you know now about World War II kit, right? And that is very specific knowledge. Like, I know you've always been interested in World War II, but in the same way that you've always been interested in like cowboys and samurai and World War I and the Vietnam War and just about any other conflict and period in history, the Roman Empire, you name it, right? You're generally interested in history. That's why you did history university. And you knew a lot about World War II. But what I mean is your knowledge now is hyper specialized on one particular part, which is, if I'm not mistaken, is U.S. Army infantry late war World War II.
For sure. And I really wouldn't have dug into that the way I have. And I have to give, huge props to John, who's pointed me a lot of stuff to read without this interest.
Yep.
One of the things that's definitely... I'd almost actually say been precipitated by airsoft in sort of my ongoing structure of weird things I enjoy is that I do find living history stuff really, really interesting. Or as Johnny would call it, experimental archaeology. I didn't, when I was doing my degree, encounter anything like this sort of notion of, well, we're interested in how the physical kit felt, right? What is it like to run 5K in full combat kit for U.S. infantry World War II? Answer.
Spoiler alert, it sucks.
Yeah, answer. Awful. But, that's knowledge I have that I wouldn't have. And it's an interest that I have that I wouldn't have. And I've developed a real interest in, at risk of, getting too in-depth, and Phil will stop me, thankfully, if I do. My interest in sort of armed conflict and stuff has often been, to borrow from Chris, very theoretical, right? In the sense that, I'm very interested in World War II, and I always have been. Samurai, knights, Vikings, all that stuff. And so, little kid me knew a lot about arms and armor. And adult me does too, but mostly because of little kid me. I've gotten very interested in the soldier's eye view of the battlefield. And that's definitely a thing that comes from playing airsoft. right? And it's a very different approach from reading a general's account of a battle, which
Mm-hmm.
tells you some interesting things and gives you a very different picture. But that's incredibly cool to me, right? And so I have historical kit. You know, I have a sort of 1800s, 900s ish Viking slash Danish slash Norman kit. And you know, man, those shoes are terrible. Like, my God, you have no idea how good modern boots are until you try to walk around in like just leather turn shoes. Ugh. But that's an interest that for me comes out of playing airsoft. That comes out of going, you know, because our initial kit impression really was like, yeah, we're going to get a U.S. Marine high-rise and we're going to get multicam and we're going to look very Gucci for 2004, and
Mm-hmm.
then we're going to realize that, oh my God, like none of this is practical for airsoft. Like, I do not need 42 M4 mags for playing airsoft.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And that got me interested in, okay, so what's good in World War II kit? What's cool about it other than the Garand being sexy as hell and getting nice boots? And that's, yeah, it's stuff that I would not have. That's hobbies and interests that I wouldn't have and knowledge that I wouldn't have were it not for playing airsoft. Because regrettably, one of the quantifiable problems of life for me is that there's a finite number of books you can read.
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces that you touched on, but I think is important, is the perspective that it brings you. So it's one thing to talk about knowledge, and it's one thing to talk about like the experiences, but the perspective. When Johnny talks about experimental archaeology or living history or whatever you want to call it, what you are getting at is a glimpse into the agency of somebody else, right? What they would have what they would have experienced. And I remember talking to a guy who used to play here, who again came to Newfoundland and then left Newfoundland, but made an impact on me. Was a guy named Billy, and he was the first guy who I had ever really seen interested in World War II airsoft before. So Billy I mean, he's obviously he's a really cool guy, very diverse interests, and he had like this World War II kit. Was it, to use a term that Johnny uses, was it FARB? Like, probably, but that's okay. I didn't know any better at the time. He had a pup tent, he had a bunch of stuff, and it was really cool, right? And he said something that has lasted, that has really stuck in my mind, which is that, you know, if I do all of this and I feel 1% of what a soldier would have felt back in World War II, then that's all I'm looking for. Because it gives me that perspective. If I go, oh man, this sucks, imagine that that's your reality. It's 10 times worse, 100 times worse than that. Well, then you're getting that perspective that otherwise you never would have been able to get. So it's certainly something you can get from airsoft, and not necessarily from playing airsoft, because, I mean, yeah, sure, that's part of it, but just that experience. If you, like you, Pat, you would never get that outside of this.
No, there's absolutely no world in which I owned World War II US kit, went for a jog in it, or humped my gear to an airsoft field and ran around with people shooting BBs at me without playing this game. And yeah, that's pretty much as in depth a simulationist experience as you can safely have, right? Like, I don't particularly want to go get shot at. You know, I have tremendous respect for people who do that for a living. I just wouldn't be.
Would rather avoid
Yeah,
it.
yeah. It's.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd be good at it either, but yeah, it's a matter of, I won't say sharing that experience, obviously, but of coming as close to understanding it as you probably can, right? And for a person who often, God help me, thinks of themselves as a scholar, that's tremendous. That's really, really cool, right? It applies to the medieval stuff as well. Like, you know, finding out what it feels like to get hit in with a sword while you're wearing chainmail was an experience.
Yeah.
So is finding out what wearing chainmail for 5 hours feels like. Okay, spoilers,
Yeah.
again, sucks. But that is really, really cool. And these are experiences that I wouldn't have without this hobby, without this sport. And that bring value to me professionally, because I promise you, you hand a bunch of kids a suit of chainmail and go, here, try this on, while you're talking about medieval knights, and they're immediately way more interested. Physical artifacts bring a whole wicked thing to the classroom. The fact that I can talk about battles in World War II from this is tactically and strategically what was going on, and this is sort of the like home front experience and stuff like that has always been useful for engaging kids. But the fact that I can talk about having put on the gear and run around in it also adds humongous value. And frankly, the fact that I can bring in my kit, toss it on a kid, and be like, all right, run up and down the stairs 5 times. How would you describe that? Terrible? There you go. Right? Like, it's always funny because you get the athletic kid who's like, oh, I can do that, no problem. And then they're like, oh my God, why?
And I think, too, there's one piece here that is not really an issue for you because of your background, but for lots of people, they've never had to research anything, right? Even when you're in school, like the amount of actual hardcore research that you need to do is pretty light, right? And so when you're building a World War II kit, talking to John and talking to you about it, there's a huge piece of understanding primary sources, secondary sources, validating information that you see when you see something that doesn't really mesh with what you're looking for. If this looks out of place, you're going to try and find another source to justify it. Otherwise, you might not really trust that source and just say, you know what, I'm not going to discount this piece of it. I'm going to discount this piece of evidence because I have no corroboration other than this one thing. And that's an important skill that you can learn from doing this.
And you get to enjoy some of the really the rewarding bits of it for a researcher and for a historian, like amidst your play, because you get to go look at the pictures, and if you're me, you go read the manual about how to put your kit together for World War II, late war GIs, and then you go look at what they're actually doing with it, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can see these obvious, like, no, I moved that because where it's supposed to be was terrible. And frankly, you then go, I'm going to move that and see how it feels. And you're like, oh yeah, nope. Like, not surprisingly, but yeah, they figured their shit out.
Right.
But yeah, it's a place to practice those skills for people who have them, but it's also, a place to develop them. And I got to say, the sort of reenacting community in general online has been very helpful. They're very giving with information. They're very passionate. They want you to go read stuff. So everyone should go do some sort of World War II impression kit so that I have more people to do World War impression airsoft with. That's my completely unbiased suggestion.
Hey, listen, it's not really my thing, but if you, like Johnny will tell you, if you give it to me, I'll wear it and I'll make a fool of myself. And I do plan on having a podcast at some point talking about some of my experiences wearing the World War II kit, but that I'll save that for another conversation.
Another evening.
I want to close it out by coming back to the people thing that we started out with, right? So you meet lots of different people, you get an opportunity to make friends that you wouldn't have met and made otherwise. But there's one absolute skill that you can learn from airsoft that we have talked about a lot, and that is absolutely valuable in your everyday life, in your workplace as well, and that is leadership. Leadership is not taught in school, right? One of the ways that leadership will manifest itself in school is teachers and like coaches and stuff will say, oh yeah, he's a leader, he's a natural born leader, and teachers may feel the same way. But none of your courses are really about leadership development. You really need to look at extracurricular activities to get some of that training. And airsoft absolutely is one of those extracurriculars because you have an opportunity to work on a team, and then you have the opportunity to show up as a leader, both in terms of coming up with strategies and plans and getting people to execute on those plans, which is one aspect of leadership. But you also have this other aspect of leadership, which is being a role model, right? Showing people the ropes, supporting people, helping them get better. And all of those things you can learn at the airsoft field. It's not always about being a combat leader or about being your squad leader or whatever, but it's just about learning how to deal with people and engage with them in ways that allows you to support them and help them. And then as a result of that, being more influential. And those are skills that are absolutely marketable, that are not necessarily in great supply in everybody, and it's something you can really practice at the airsoft field if that's something you're inclined to do.
And it's the sort of thing that you can actively focus on developing. And these are not skills that are necessarily things that get built up in sort of everyday life, right?
Hmm.
There are programs, yes, as you said, almost always sort of extracurricular programs, but there are programs at schools where you can take advantage of it and try to grow in that way. But once you're out of school, you're basically at try team sports of some sort,
Yeah,
or volunteering, right? And try to sort of work your way through volunteering and try to be a motivator and stuff like that. And it's tremendously useful.
absolutely. I mean, skills just as simple as how do you get a group of people to listen to you and pay attention to what you're saying, right? And a lot of people, we've talked about this before, a lot of people hit the airsoft field and they think they have to pretend like they're a drill sergeant. They feel like they have to shout and bark orders and curse and swear and just be the loudest person in the room to get people to pay attention to what they have to say. And that's not at all the case. Sure, yeah, if you're loud, people pay attention to you in the sense that they turn their head and go, oh my God, who's being so loud? But they're not going to listen necessarily to what you have to say.
And you're not necessarily going to get any mileage out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like, again, we have talked about this before. There's a big difference between having people hear what you are saying and having people be aware that you're talking.
Yeah.
And airsoft is a really great place to practice, as weird as it might sound, a lot of the more humility-oriented aspects of being a good leader. Because, as a typical example, right, one of the core things is, yeah, you got to lead from the front a lot of the time, right? And this is airsoft. The first person through the breach does not tend to have a great time,
Yeah, for sure.
relatively speaking. But if you are that person, then people will see you being that person, and they will go, "Oh, A, he moved. I need to. B, it's okay to get shot, right? Like you don't suck at airsoft because you got hit.
Mm-hmm.
And C, they'll respect the fact that you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, as it were, right? Like if you make the plan and you execute the part of the plan that's the highest risk, even if you get smoked and the plan succeeds, people are going to be happy with you.
Absolutely.
And if the plan doesn't succeed, at least they'll be, right there with you going like, man, not such a good idea in some ways, but like, hey, we had fun, we learned, great, right? And they won't be like, oh, well, he told us to do this and then he sat back and didn't.
Yeah. And I think when you think about leadership, and I spent a lot of time in my extracurriculars and I spent a lot of time in my career, and I still do, working on leadership with people, because many people think that leadership is just coming up with a plan and getting people to do what you tell them to, right? To execute the plan. And that is certainly a facet of leadership, but the way that you actually achieve that in practice is very different than just saying, hey, do this. There are certain circumstances where absolutely that is the right thing to do. And if you think about a military situation, for example, if you were being shot at and someone says to you, your sergeant or whoever in your fire team says, hey, go do that. That is not a place for you to go, man, do you really think? It's like, no, we need this done now because lives are on the line. And that's totally fair. But in the airsoft space, nobody's going to die, right? So we have an opportunity to not get stressed out about the situation, to be more collaborative about our approach and make sure that A, we come up with a plan that works for everybody. B, it's a plan that most people feel comfortable executing. And C, that after the fact, we can sort of talk about, okay, well, what happened and what can we do next time? These are all facets of leadership. We talk about how we do after action reviews about what happened on the field, and we do that in a blameless way. Like it's not a matter of, oh, well, you did this, you suck, but what are the facts of what occurred? And we have conversations about it. All of these are facets of leadership. Those are displaying skills that allow you to show other people that you don't just care about the end result. You care about how you get there and how we can all get there as a team. That's super important. And that gets lost, I think, in the fog a lot of times by people showing up and being like, rah, 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 drill sergeant, and just barking and shouting. And you're not getting the sort of buy-in that you need from people to actually get stuff done on the field. Because at the end of the day, if your objective is to get from point A to point B and you say, hey, can you take that corner for me? And they go, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. What have you achieved exactly? Because that person is not bound to obey your orders, right? So you need to figure out a way to get him to do the thing that you're suggesting without having to strong arm them, right? Which we would not be able to do on the field anyway. So there's a really good opportunity for you to work on those skills and develop them. And I would say, based on my experience playing airsoft, that outside of the individual players who are very, very strong individual performers, and we have several in our community. I think about like Matt, who's one of the refs at the field, like just a crazily, crazily skilled individual player. Outside of that, the teams that succeed the most are the ones that are able to clearly communicate with each other and support each other's through the game, because they have this sort of leadership dialogue that occurs where they are comfortable with each other, they understand what the greater goals are, and they're perfectly willing to do what's needed to be done. And you can't just get there by shouting at people. It's never going to happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, teamwork is what wins any airsoft game we win.
Yeah.
Period. Right? Like, yes, we've got guys on our team who have really high personal skills. Like Chris is fantastic, Kyle, but working together, Chris and I are significantly more effective than just Chris, even though I'm not as good as he is.
Yeah. There's also one last thing about leadership that I think is very important. I've mentioned it before, but I think that airsoft is a really good place, especially through your after action reviews. It's a really good place to understand where other people are better at things than you are, and to learn to accept that the fact that someone else is better at something than you doesn't threaten your skill level, but rather it enhances everybody around you, right? The fact that Chris is a better, faster shooter than I am doesn't threaten me. It does not mean that I am worse at what I do. I'm still exactly at the same level that I was before. The fact that Chris is better than me does nothing to my own skill level. And so I'm not threatened by that. I understand that by playing with Chris, I have an opportunity to get better. And if you can understand that, then you are miles ahead of tons of people who try to be leaders by just shouting, and who basically in some ways fear for their own authority that other people will think that they're not as good as they are, because that's not what leadership is about. And if you can get to that place, you will be a much more successful leader. And airsoft can absolutely teach you that. And to come back to what you were saying before, Pat, that it's a form of humility, right? Understanding where you are at compared to everybody else in a real objective way and not feeling threatened by that is huge. It's absolutely huge, and you can get that from airsoft.
Not only can you get it, but it's a skill, right?
Well, yes.
So it's not just a thing you learn and then you're like, oh, I'm good at it. It's a thing that requires practice, right? And yeah, going, hey, this guy's better than me at this stuff. I'm going to let them take point on that. Or I'm not going to be threatened by it and I'm going to work with them. Or I'm going to not be threatened by it and learn from them, even though my ego might say, oh, I don't know if I should be chill about this. Yeah, it's a huge thing and it's tremendously important. And practicing it is awesome.
So guys, if you listened so far, thank you very much. We really appreciate you sticking with us for right now. Obviously, there's a lot to airsoft, and many of us who play airsoft, really, especially if you're starting out, the only thing you want to do is play airsoft. It's like, airsoft, gear, guns, everything. Let's go, let's go, let's go. But the longer you play, I really, really encourage you, I think Pat as well, to take a bit of time to think about and consider what else you're getting from the sport other than just the fun of playing it. And when you sort of take stock of all the things that you're learning that are sort of tangentially related to airsoft, but not directly related to airsoft, you'll start to see different areas where there are potentially skills that you would want to pick up and work on and develop, or that you can translate some of your knowledge, whether that is through photography or making videos, whether that is through leadership and volunteering, whether it is through working with other people, or maybe even stuff as silly as doing your first aid and progressing as a first aider, or learning how to do electrical stuff like Pat with the gun teching. There's tons of different things you can learn from airsoft. We've really droned on about it, but really take stock of the things that you find interesting and the areas that you can grow.
And hopefully you found this interesting. It's definitely been a fun chat, and we will talk to you all next week.
Absolutely. And guys, if you can't wait till next week and you want to have a chat with us, jump on the Discord. The link is in the description. As you can see, we spend a lot of time talking to people there. It's really active. It's a super fun community, and we would love to have you as a member. But until next time, we will talk to you next week. Take care, everyone.
Cheers, guys.